Thank you so much for joining us for this session of Impact State of Mind. I'm John-Paul Parmigiani, CEO and co-founder of Impact Hub New York Metropolitan Area. Impact Hub New York Metropolitan Area is a nonprofit supporting entrepreneurs and change makers through programs designed to help impactful ideas succeed. Impact State of Mind is a virtual series created to support and connect the social innovation community during the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you so much for joining for this session, which is Unpacking the Data, Building an Inclusive Startup Ecosystem in the New York City Area. This event is in partnership with StartOut and Socos Labs, which are some of our most cherished partners. I'm also wearing a hat as a volunteer in the programming board of StartOut, and I'm so proud of what that organization does. So I'm actually going to pass the mic over to Sandra, so to speak, who is actually with StartOut, the Inclusion Impact Index's project expert, to tell you a little bit more about StartOut and about the work that they're doing in collaboration with Socos Labs.
Thank you. Hello, and a special thanks to John Paul and the team at Impact Hub for organizing this event, as well as the other panelists. It's great to be here with everybody. And I just want to take a minute to introduce StartOut in a little more detail. We were founded in 2009 and are a national 501(c) nonprofit. StartOut's the largest organization supporting LGBTQ plus entrepreneurs with over 17,000 members nationwide. Our mission is to increase the number of diversity and impact of LGBTQ entrepreneurs and to amplify their stories to drive economic empowerment for the community. Through StartOut, queer entrepreneurs have access to industry experts, mentors. We have a startup growth lab, an accelerated program. We have a very active investor portal, an annual demo day, and with COVID, we've taken all of our city programming spread around the country, and everything's virtual. So we have a pretty active programming schedule. So for those interested, go check us out at startout.org. So we're here to talk about data and unpacking the data. And Em and I work for StartOut. Emma's at Socos, and just a little background on the initial impact survey. So in July of last year, StartOut and Socos introduced the StartOut Pride Economic Impact Index. The diversity and inclusion study was funded by JP Morgan Chase as part of their $150 million Small Business Forward initiative to invest in underserved entrepreneurs. The goal of the initial project was to quantify unrealized potential of high growth LGBTQ and female entrepreneurs for the benefit of the US economy. While integration and underserved entrepreneurs may have progressed over the last decade, their access to critical resources is still far from equal. This is partly due to the lack of reliable data on the contributions of LGBTQ and female entrepreneurs who create jobs, raise capital, file patents, and innovate. Last month, we took that survey and to the second phase, and we've rolled out what we're calling the Inclusion Impact Index, where we're focusing on all entrepreneurs in the US. And we've partnered with over 24 tech companies and startups to help us amplify that we're going out to all entrepreneurs, and we want to gather more data for the survey. So the good thing about our data is everything is updated in near real time, and you can access it 24/7. And you can see the data findings from over 120,000 different startups in the US 24/7. We'll never charge for the data, and you can look at the data, all entrepreneurs, female entrepreneurs, and LGBTQ. So I think at this point, I'd love to introduce Emma so she can show you what the impact survey looks like and drill into it a little more so you can understand how you can gain access to the data and use it as you wish. So Emma from Socos, she's one of our data scientists, and I turn the mic over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sandra. So hi, everyone. My name is Emma. I am the data scientist at Socos Labs, currently managing all parts of this project. which I'm so excited to be able to work on. So I will go ahead and share my screen so that I can sort of show you guys what the index is, how you can use it, what it's best for, right? So when you Google or put in your search bar socos.org/index, this is the map that pops up of the United States, aggregated by every metro that we have over 50 high growth entrepreneurs. So just some terms I want to get out of the way so that we're all on the same page. What does this data represent? So we look for and search within the Crunchbase and PitchBook databases for high growth entrepreneurs across the US. What this means are entrepreneurs that have raised $1 million in venture capital funding, have received some type of angel funding, have patents or created jobs outside of the founding team, and or have an IPO. So we focus primarily on these big, rather impactful startup businesses, right? So what we're seeing here, aggregated by city, each city and their funding, jobs, patents, and exits created by their entrepreneurs over the past 20 years. So obviously we are a New York, we are looking specifically at New York today, so I will sort of delve into New York's data. So what we have in New York, what we found, $220 billion in funding over the past 20 years, almost 900,000 jobs, 50 billion in exits, et cetera, from our 19,000 counted entrepreneurs in New York. What this means in general, right? Or sorry, really quickly, one thing I do also want to highlight, right? So what are the colors? What are the sizes of the bubbles? What are we actually looking at here? So one thing that's important is our index score. What this index score represents is a single metric that sort of represents all 4 of these output variables that we like to track per city, right? So this single variable is able to tell us what we think the achievement gap is in each city based on these metrics. So we say that for New York, for all entrepreneurs, it has around an 86, which means it does have it still has quite a bit that we can reach, right? But relative to most other cities in the US, its entrepreneurial population does pretty well. It is a relatively healthy entrepreneurial space for all entrepreneurs, right? So I'd like to just highlight that piece, right? We can look at it specifically for female and LGBTQ, but I'll get to that piece in a second. So yes, this is basically the forefront of the index. Now, the real question is, how is this impactful? What can we do with it? One thing I do also want to highlight, what are these bars? What are the achievable versus counted? What do they genuinely mean? So what we try to do, right, is tell you, sure, New York has raised $220 billion in funding, but we think that is genuinely, it is a valuable possible number to achieve 250, right? So these achievables, what they are based on, sorry, I'll slow down. What these achievables are based on are not some magical world where every entrepreneur has access to funding and resources are unlimited, right? What they're really based on are the highest performing cities in the US, and mapping that onto every other city to show its potential, right? Because if we know that this amount of funding or patents are capable of being created, raised in a certain city, what is stopping fellow cities from reaching those same overall potentials, right? So when we look at San Francisco, for example, we see that it ranks highest in the US for patents. Now, this may make sense because of San Francisco's industries or environment or how much funding they do have access to. But for New York, why is it not possible to have a similar level, which for New York, we estimate is 20,000 patents. Whereas right now, we only count about 7,000, right? So that is what our achievables tell us, that in a real, possible, genuine world, we believe that your city is capable of reaching these specific values, right? Compared to what they are creating currently. So I think this is a pretty basic overview. Hopefully you can see how this can be impactful. Our goal is to show, right, how your current metro is doing, how the health is for specific entrepreneurs, the target groups that we currently have access to, but also what you are capable of, right? So I didn't really properly introduce Socos Labs, but what we do is we like to solve messy human problems. And one of those is helping human beings, every human being, maximize their full potential. In this project specifically, we do focus on entrepreneurs, and we do believe that these achievable numbers are our way of showing what these entrepreneurs are capable of. So yeah, I can get into details specifically, but I will turn it back to JP for now, in case we have any questions or want to turn the conversation elsewhere. So
great, thank you so much. So actually, I just want to maybe ask between you and Sandra. So we know that some of the statistics coming out of your research are incredibly powerful, right? So we've seen that only 1 in 10 women are leading high growth scaling startups at this point. And we know that you've also measured the tremendous economic gap that could have been filled if we had a more equitable environment for entrepreneurs across the US and also in the New York City area. And I was just wondering if you could tell us more about what your hopes of how this how this index will advance and how it can possibly help others to combat some of the issues that are being revealed through your data.
Yeah, so I mean, the first phase of the survey looked at LGBTQ and female-run businesses, and you could see when we looked at all, those achievement gaps were pretty green. But if you drill into the US and looking at the data through that map, you'll start seeing a lot more red and orange and showing throughout the country that there is definitely a big gap in what could be. And, just looking at the New York numbers, you quoted one point from the findings. Today, 1 in 20 patent grants are from women, and this is in the New York Metro area. You can see that so many more, 90,000 additional jobs in the New York area could have been obtained with equal funding and resources. So right now, I mean, we're certainly looking at highlighting and making the data available for everyone to use it. So we do have a more level playing ground.
Got it. And before we move to the panel to unpack some of the findings as well, I was wondering if you could tell us more about how others can plug into your work to continue to advance it, to make sure that the data sets are full and people can start using the data.
Right. So as Emma mentioned, we received a lot of our data from major sources, Crunchbase and PitchBook, but our survey is open for all people to self-identify or basically go out and fill the survey in themselves. A few minutes, 2 to 4 minutes to fill it out, and it's confidential. So the data that you ultimately see, the data findings, everything's confidential. Nothing can be traced back to any individual person submitting it. We also are looking for additional partners who can help share the survey and include it in their newsletter, give us some social media love about that, and spread the word on the survey. So we're still gathering data in Q1 and Q2, and then we will start publishing our findings.
Great. So now we'll shift over to our panel. We have an amazing panel that we're hoping to have some lively discussion about how we can get to a more inclusive startup ecosystem to return these opportunities to the rest of the country in terms of filling the economic gaps that exist between communities and making sure that at the same time, the economy is performing its full potential, which is in everybody's interest and no one should dispute. So we have a really great panel. We have Diana Franco, who is Executive Director of We NYC and Launch Initiatives with the New York City Small Business Services Department. We have Tiffany Townsend, who is a Senior VP of External Affairs at Brooklyn Navy Yard Development Corporation, doing amazing work in Brooklyn through that institution. And we have Kenrick Ross, who is the Executive Director at the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance, and who's also an Impact Fellow at Impact Hub New York Metropolitan Area for his work as a startup entrepreneur that he's also spearheading. So thank you all for joining the panel. It's a real honor to have you on board. So I'm hoping to start actually, Deanna, with you for a moment. So we know, we heard a little bit about how women entrepreneurs are not yet being able to access their full potential through some of the data that's been found through StartOut. But we know from your work as well that there has been a lot of progress by women in the entrepreneurial front from small businesses and startups, where we've seen more than a 21% increase in the last 5 or so years, and women in particular who are from women of color have grown at something like 43%, which is in the New York City area, which is double the national average. What is working? What's not working? What's left to be done to create a truly inclusive environment for women to succeed as entrepreneurs?
Yes, I think there are a couple of factors there. One, it is, I think we need more funding for women. We all know that. But I think we also need some kind of social change on how women are engaged in the day-to-day, for instance, activities at home, I mean, in society, and what they do. So I would say like funding is a big piece. And maybe the way I see it, it's beyond alternative sources of funding or investment. I think we talked a little bit about this when we prepped this panel. I'm thinking more about, for instance, guarantee loans, because we know a lot of women with potential, with great ideas to develop their businesses, with businesses that are actually doing well. But then you see, like, when they really want to, when they need to go and apply or acquire some funding, in many cases, they usually have less assets, fewer assets than men, so they don't have enough collateral. So, for instance, that's one thing that I'll be thinking. That's something that I'll be thinking a lot. It's like what women need basically in terms of funding, besides all that we know, but something that could be new and a strength in our city. It's more programs with collateral benefits for women, because they don't have the assets, because they tend to have a lower credit scores for many reasons. So it's like a different lens of how we support funding for women. That's one thing. The other thing, it is, I would say, as I was saying, to me, it's also like a kind of a social change. I mean, we need to accept the reality that women still are the main caregivers at home. So you can't compare a woman who is a model, who is running a tech startup, and is at the same time taking kids to school. So I think like it needs to be something when women have more time and more mind space to do that. That doesn't mean like women won't be the, I want to be the caregiver for the people I love, for my kids, for my parents, but it needs to be something like men needs to be more involved. We need to find ways where women can have access to more resources that allow them to dedicate the time that they need to actually grow their businesses. So I think is that those two things, it's funding, something that we still can do better, definitely for women, not only in New York City, but all around the country. And that social change of what we can do for women so they have the mind space and the time to prosper in the same way that men have the time and the opportunities.
Got it. And how does the city view that gap? Are you looking at that gap as this is an opportunity to make sure that we're hitting our social justice goals? Are we looking at that as the opportunity for the city to also be able to deliver its full economic potential? Is this like an employment? Like what are the, how does the city view filling this gap that's so important?
I always talk, first of all, NYC, which is the initiative of the city to empower women entrepreneurs to start and operate businesses, was announced 5 years ago. And at that moment was probably the first city initiative that comprehensive, not only in the US, but probably in the world, because every year in the State of Women, when the UN runs that every March. We receive tons of requests for other cities that want to learn about our model. So New York City, I mean, it's been a pioneer on that vision. That's one thing. That doesn't mean that it's perfect. I always say that, but I will be there. We're trying to be the first, doing the best we can. So it's always been important in that way, like bringing that diversity, being inclusive. Now, the other piece is, I always say, and when I talk about the gender gap, it's not only about the gender gap, it's about numbers. I mean, people do business because they want return of investment and revenue. So that's another lens for the city. This is an economic development initiative. It is like if women make the same amount of money, income, and employ the same amount of people that men, that's a huge economic development for the city. So it is not only something about diversity, which is very important, but it's also about how we grow and we improve the city's economic landscape.
Okay, and I'm going to ask Tiffany if maybe you could add to that. So the Brooklyn Navy Yard, you guys do an incredible job. You support some 450 businesses, right? And that involves over 11,000 people. And what I really like about what the Brooklyn Navy Yard does in some way is that it seems like in some way it's a nexus point for people who have come to Brooklyn with ideas, but then it's also a place for people who are from Brooklyn to bring their ideas and make their dreams come true. And so I'm wondering, because I know that you all are very intentional about how you work with different communities, like what is your reaction to filling the gap between the different groups and between women entrepreneurs and others?
Oh, that's a big question. So I'll give everybody just a very 2-second primer on what the Navy Yard is. And so we sit on the Brooklyn waterfront, 300 acres. And as you said, JP, we're home to about 450 businesses, and that employs about 11,000 people across a variety of different sectors. And the areas that we really focus on are across manufacturing, keeping the industrial sector alive and well in New York City. And when we look at manufacturing, that is really everything from food production to sort of next generation tech. So we like to fondly say, internally, that we're kind of like Noah's Ark. We have like a little bit of everything, a little bit of tech, a little bit of food, a little bit of welding, a little bit of woodworking, and really we span from everything from very non-traditional to very traditional roles like woodworkers and metal workers. And so our model really focuses on 3 areas. One is being a landlord and developer. We have about 80 buildings that we own and operate. We are a supportive landlord. And this is really where it kind of comes to your question of how do we provide an environment for businesses to scale and grow faster than they otherwise would in pretty much any other environment across the city. And then the third leg of our business stool is really on workforce development, and that is connecting people who live in this communities that surround the Navy Yard to job opportunities at the Yard. And so what we have focused on traditionally, particularly when it comes to business growth and workforce development, is a couple of different areas. We focused on, I would say, diverse communities in the sense of really touching communities of color. So our sort of catchment area are the 11 zip codes that surround the Navy Yard. So that includes Dumbo and Vinegar Hill and Bed-Stuy and Clinton Hill and Williamsburg. So it's a really diverse slices of Brooklyn. And what we want is that the people who live in those communities will either keep their businesses here and grow, or bring their businesses to the Navy Yard to grow them. And so I think when you're looking at women, for one, I think that's part of our mix. Even though we're focusing so much on communities of color, we bring women along with us when we're focusing on how do we support those businesses. So I'm not sure. I think there may have been another question in there, but feel free to please pepper me just to make sure I cover everything.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, especially because when we look at the US too, right? Brooklyn is one of the places that leads the nation, right? It's one of the most diverse areas in the entire country and the entire world, right? So you have like tons of people who are representing different communities, different socioeconomic groups, different language groups and all of this. Are there any challenges that you guys have to bring all these communities together and create a really fair environment for them?
I think for us, it's almost easy to bring everybody together, but I think because we have such a diverse community that it's hard, and or it's our big challenge to make sure that we can service all of those diverse types of businesses. So we have everything from Cry Precision, which makes gear for the military, and they're probably, $100 million business. I'm making that up, but they do very, very well, to people who are just starting out in a room together and have design concepts and product concepts. And so how do we, and particularly my team, which handles business support services, how do you provide a robust and like the right suite of services to service those different kinds of businesses and their very different needs? And so that's actively what our business support services team works on. And then one other thing we're currently working on actually at the Yard is an equity incubator. And so we recently, this past fall, we went out and we cast a very wide net in RFEOI asking anybody who's in this space to bring us the best ideas about how do we create an incubator that's focused on minority-owned businesses, and in particular Black-owned businesses. And so we're just now in that selection process, and actually SBS is a partner with us in that selection process. So we're really excited about where this is going to go. But that's sort of one of our next big projects. And for us, that came out of a conversation, or a lot of conversations, about naming what the real barriers are to entry for different groups, and particularly Black-owned businesses or Hispanic-owned businesses or what have you, and really recognizing that the challenges for those groups are different than many of the companies that have come before them that may have been owned by men, that may have been owned by white men, or whatever that is, and recognizing that there are different barriers to entry for all of those groups to really scale and grow. And so, I mean, I'll give you a very short example. One thing that we have found over time is that sometimes it's as simple as daycare being a barrier to entry for people who want to start a business, right? Maybe you're switching gears from another place in your life and you have kids. And, I think in this moment, the pandemic, everyone's realizing just how hard it is to parent while you're in the midst of the pandemic, while you're trying to work. And there are a lot of people who've been sort of juggling that particular equation, but we realize something as simple as addressing quality daycare that is accessible and easy is something that actually can help a tremendous number of people excel in growing their businesses.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to us unpacking that as a group. But before I do, I have a quick question for Kenrick. So Kenrick, right now is obviously a very important moment for the Asian community in America because of the recent events that happened. And finally, people are starting to pay attention that the Asian American community, which in some ways has been very successful, does still not have the full access that they deserve to resources and opportunities as others in America might. And I just wanted to ask you to start, how you think some of the barriers have been set up around the Asian community, preventing them to succeed to the full extent that they're capable of. And what is the silver lining in this moment that maybe having such national focus on the challenges for the Asian community in America? What can we make of this to make everything move in the direction it should go?
Absolutely. So I'll just start with a little snippet of what Incapia is. So Incapia is a federation of 62 very small grassroots LGBTQ API organizations across the country and in the Pacific. And we do everything from capacity building for grassroots organizations to advancing an equity agenda for LGBTQ API folks across the country and for the communities that we live in. So we do a lot of this work intersectionally and in coalition. And before I got Incapia 7 weeks ago, I spent 4 years in equitable entrepreneurship, I guess you would call it. I ran a legal services program that was funded by SBS for under-resourced businesses in New York City, and then did a little bit of policy work on Black and brown businesses and the pandemic and surviving the pandemic. So I'll bring all those things to my answer. I'll go first with a silver lining. because the silver lining is related to the first question. One major silver lining of this moment is that the minority myth around API folks is fracturing, and hopefully we will deconstruct it. And that's important because the model minority framework for API people characterize us in a certain way and also erases certain things. So under that model minority myth, do we have an idea of what a high growth startup API founder looks like? We tend not to. We and I say this as a society, we tend to think of API folks in two broad buckets, right? We think of entrepreneurship as very grassroots. It's a small business. It's discrete, income generating, survivalist in many ways, but it is not highly scalable. And we also don't believe that the folks who are in those businesses can scale them because they are just doing the work, right? They don't have the tools. And for the most part, American society has been comfortable with that, right? It helps to create wedges between different communities of color, the good immigrant versus folks who have been here for a very long time. It also creates categories. If you're in New York City, you associate Chinese with Chinese restaurants, Yemenis with bodegas. It's an easy way to say, look at the entrepreneurship. It is, great what they're doing, but it is very discrete and it's very limited. And then we think of these businesses being related to API folks entering a professional class. So they're in tech, they are in the professions, they are in services. But in those two definitions of the very discrete small business, but not the startup, and professional folks, one, we miss Asian poverty, which is a huge problem because we believe that everyone is either a small business owner or a member of the middle class. And two, we don't have examples in the popular imagination of what a high growth startup founder looks like. And this does not mean they don't exist, because we know they exist. Today, there's been a list going around social media of so many companies, tech companies, for example, that are founded by API folks, including Zoom, that we're on. But that narrative doesn't exist. And it's important to point out that narrative doesn't exist because startups tend to take, from the funding point of view, a higher level of funding, a higher level of risk, a higher level of trust. We also know that Asian Americans, we have these examples of Asians, but not Asian Americans, heading large companies. Tech companies, MasterCard, several law firms, they tend to be drawn from Asia, not from the Asian American community. And this is important because Asian Americans in corporate America are least likely to be promoted into management, into the roles that eventually lead them to lead companies. And studies have shown that the impression is these are employees that are great at technical skills, are good at operational skills. They will not be given presentation opportunities. They will not be given leadership opportunities. If you're looking for high growth founders, you need vision, you need leadership, you need presentation. If a funder doesn't see a narrative of that person in an API person, they're much less likely to fund them. And if an API person doesn't see a narrative of them being a high growth startup founder, they are less likely to take the risk of being one.
So I heard a few things just as you were finishing related to the risk factor, right? And we've had a lot of conversations at Impact Hub about what is the responsibility to encourage people to become entrepreneurs, because it is a risky endeavor. And always when you're looking at different communities and encouraging people to take a non-conventional path. It's really important that people are aware of, you know, the balance of opportunities that they have before they dive in. At the same time, we know that there is this huge gap by the time you get to the top, right? Like as you were mentioning in the corporate setting, and as StartOut and Socos Labs are showing in relation to high growth startups. So where we're seeing a lot of progress on, you know, at the grassroots level with small businesses and startups being started for many communities, as Diana was telling us about, it's not yet translating to what is, you could say, like the most transformative level of entrepreneurialism, which are these high growth companies that really change how everyone views the world that we see around us. And so I wanted to open up to the wider panel to maybe unpack a little bit why we're only at this point where there's still this gap between some of the initial interest in forming companies and you know, becoming a startup founder and, you know, seeing the success that we know in the end. By including that, will transform economies, will transform communities, and you know, we want to see that equity all the way up the chain.
I mean, I would just say initially, I think, and I think this goes across probably a lot of communities of color, that I think about what I see at the Navy Yard, and just in terms of people are concerned about risk. And I think for a lot of entrepreneurs that we see, one of the challenges that a lot of communities don't have the same networks necessarily. And so they're afraid to take those risks. I think and again, I'm sort of speaking in a narrow slice in terms of what we see at the Navy Yard. So if we take, like, let's say somebody who would apply to our incubator in the future, maybe something that has stopped them in the past is, you know, the lack of resources in terms of having that initial capital to start up. Right. And I think that we know that for the Black community, just because of, you know, hundreds of years of structural racism, that there's a lack of generational wealth, which means that people can't go to their friends and their families the same way that other communities can to get that, let's say, that seed money to begin to start their businesses. And so they're less likely to take on that risk. They need to have something that is certainly much more of a sure bet for them. And so I think that tends to hold back, you know, this one group in particular. So I'll just speak on that, sort of that one slice.
I also, when we also talk a lot about we focus on underserved communities. Most of the women that we have served, 60% are women of color, 36% are Black, 30% are Latinas. And when we think about, is it right, like kind of encouraging entrepreneurship when they, the risk that they take is higher than any other person because they are honestly risking everything. So I also, when I talk about entrepreneurship with women in general, I think it's also kind of a skill that needs to be developed. And also talking with women about the two different kinds of entrepreneurship. There is entrepreneurship that is lifestyle, and then there is entrepreneurship that is high growth. And many women, we need more women entering in the entrepreneurship that is high growth. But for women, especially the women that we serve, obviously it's safer to enter into the entrepreneurship lifestyle, which could be need-based entrepreneurs, which could be things where they are very good. Let's say, even if it's like you are very good at making cakes, and that's your passion, and that's what you want to know. So that's something when we need to also raise awareness on. When someone is starting as an entrepreneur, it's like you need to be clear in what is the type of entrepreneur you are. And I don't think it's, not necessarily one is better than the other one. It is like you need to know where you are and what are the expectations. So if you do cakes, unless, as Tiffany was mentioning, like you have a vision and the network to open a store of cupcakes in all the country, you need to understand that that's a lifestyle that you are doing, and it's fine, and you may have more time for your kids, and I mean, there are different things that can play there for every woman. So that's one thing. And then the women, if we want more women entering in high growth industries, we need also to prepare them better for that. Like, what do you need? I mean, that piece of network. It's always been very interesting to me, because social capital to me, I mean, and I'm an entrepreneur, it is even more important than funding. Because if you have the right friends, you have someone who will invest in your business. If you have the right friends, you have clients, because they will try your products, or at least if they have some kind of influence, they will tell others, hey, you should try this, my friend is doing this and that. So that, to me, social capital is even more important than funding, because the social capital can bring funding if you have the right friends. So that's one of the things, for instance, that we need to work on with women, because women, we use our relationships different than men. So when we talk about women, for instance, it's not like they don't have friends, it's like how they use those relationships. A guy, they don't care about like, hey, you are my friend, you have money, you should invest in my business if you really support me. Women don't feel the same way going to your friends and asking for money. In fact, one of our most successful programs in NYC is called We Fund Crowd, and which is a crowdfunding-based product in partnership with Kiva. And it was like pretty interesting to me when we started to talk with women about crowdfunding is the fastest growing source of funding source in the world, and the only one when women outperform men. But still in New York City, not all the women that we were, it was like we found in our research, I mean, 5 years ago, was like 17% of women were thinking in crowdfunding. And when you talk with them, it was this idea about like crowdfunding was asking for money. And asking for money to your friends. So, because that's how you use your social network. So going back to your point, I think it's when we talk about entrepreneurship, we need to have teach all entrepreneurs what is the type of entrepreneurship that they are doing, what are the expectations, and prepping better to enter in high growth industries, not only in terms of funding, but also in terms of soft skills, social skills. It is more complex than it looks. That's why every time people come to me talking about the challenges of entrepreneurship, and they go always to funding, which is true, but it's also like the most like basic answer. There's a lot more than funding. There are problems that could even solve the funding issue, but we just don't look at them, and especially for demographics that are underserved and in disadvantage in some way.
I would also add two quick things on mitigating risk. One, we as a society can do this by mitigating certain risks, right? We know quite honestly, childcare, elder care are barriers to women starting businesses and succeeding in businesses. Let us remove those barriers. That is something that we can do that is relatively low cost, because it's a high benefit thing in the aggregate. And two, and that will of course encourage more women or under-resourced small business owners to enter the space, but also for the folks who are already in that space, we should also shift the definitions of what things are. I see tons of highly scaled businesses that look exactly like a small business, except for the fact that someone said you should take, as Dan, I think, was saying about the cookie company across the country, or cakes or across the country, by slapping tech onto it at the end or an LY onto it at the end. And I talk to BIPOC founders all the time, and we laugh about this, that somebody will take the Caribbean roti shop and turn it into Chipotle. But it will not be us, because one, we don't have the access to actual capital, but we also don't have the social capital conditioning. We don't see ourselves in that model. So I think there are tons of businesses out there with the right technical assistance, with the right social capital infusion. They can be highly scalable, because somebody else will come and do it. It just will not look like us. And that's a loss for the communities that we're in. And I think it's a loss for those industries as well, because you can't replicate cultural competence.
So is that where having the examples from a community succeeding in high growth startups, is this where there's a lot of value that can be made through helping to unlock people's minds in terms of what they're capable of doing? Or do you think it's a matter of really getting into the weeds over the inputs that make it possible for someone to succeed?
It's a mix. I mean, you won't get to any place if you have I mean, we need to share the stories of people so entrepreneurs can relate, entrepreneurs of disadvantage in any circumstances, they can relate with success, yes, but that's not the only thing. I think it's a mix of getting the resources they need, but also changing the minds of people, not only how they see themselves, but also, for instance, an investor questioning themselves is like, why is all my portfolio of investment white people? Why? Ask yourself that. So I think when we tell those stories, we not only inspire people that it's coming, but we are also teaching something about, I mean, to investors and even to banks. I mean, this research that says like women are banks, commercial banks are biased against women. Once that exists, corporations can ask themselves, let's look at this. And I think that's where the real change comes. You need to unfold two parts. It's not only one side of the coin.
So Kendrick, there's a question that specifically is for you, but then all panelists as well, that came in from the audience, which is, how do you think we can garner more support from funders on startups led by API-led founders?
I don't know if there's one answer, or we would have many more API founders, but I do believe that we need to have more examples we need to accentuate the folks who have done this and how they've done this. So there are stories and there are examples, but we also have to understand that API founders face unique barriers. And it is, look, I started an app. I think it's innovative. I think it's visionary. If somebody looks at me and does not see a visionary person or an innovative person, but they think that I could be highly technical, or I should be running a small business, I can't change that. So we also have to have the conversation in funder circles. And an easy answer to this would be, well, we do have a international API community of high wealth people who can fund startups. That could be true. And that is true. And we have things in API communities like giving circles, for example. But there are barriers of scale. A giving circle can maybe, if we had a startup version, can fund a initial round, but they're not going to be able to scale you. Unless you can create something like Y Combinator for API folks, it's not going to happen. And maybe somebody should round up a few people to talk about that. But even then, you are still going to be stuck with narratives, and I use narrative rather than stereotypes because it's truly stereotypes of what kinds of businesses API folks should be founding. So you will still limit us on issues around innovation and industry and sector.
Tiffany, I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about maybe what's to be done for all groups or any groups, in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, because you do so much support for women, people of color, other groups as well. Like, where are you seeing from the same standpoint, on the question of access? What do you think can be done to provide a more equitable environment for funders to be accessible to all groups?
Of course I'm muted, right? So, I mean, I think it's a couple of different things, because I would say at the Yard, we're a blend of businesses, as I'd mentioned before. So we do have a lot of tenants that are ripe for growth, right? But we also do have a huge subset of businesses that really aren't necessarily interested in that. To Deanna's point about like what kind of entrepreneur are you? We have folks that want to maybe build, a solid business and only be located in Brooklyn and only have one location, and that's sort of okay. But I think what we realize, regardless of that, is that providing access across the board is really important. So like, as I mentioned, we have a business services team, and all the business education that they provide is free to tenants. So everybody has access to that. We run a cohort program, which is almost like a mini MBA boot camp of 8 to 10, or actually, no, I think it's like 10 to 12 weeks for 10 of our businesses. And that's an investment that we make in our business for them to address a particular business issue that they might be having. It could be marketing, it could be supply chain, it could be some other operational, it could be an HR issue that they're having. So making that resource free and available to businesses, I think, is really important. Something also that we do at the Navy Yard, which I think is also important, is also just the question of rent. Obviously, the pandemic has thrown real estate and everything out, like kind of out the window. But because we're in the focused so heavily on the manufacturing sector, we still have people who need to be on site and in place, and their people need to be on site and in place in order for them to actually do business. So that's still something that's a consideration set for us. But I think overall, from a values perspective, one thing that we do and continue to try to do is have honest conversations, to Kendrick's point about what narratives are out there, what's wrong with those narratives, and actually seek to talk about them and address them. So I think if funders and founders and those with money and who can provide capital aren't actually willing to have honest conversations about why they're not funding groups, or why they why they didn't fund the roti shop when it's a perfectly viable idea, just maybe it's not your viable idea because it's not, learning to take yourself out of the equation and recognize what it is and kind of be blind to it and only look at it from an opportunity perspective and not from a narrative of like, okay, well, these people do this or these people do that or whatever that is. I think that that's critically important. That's something we try to do. We don't, like anybody else, we don't always get it right, but we're willing to have an honest conversation about where we think we ought to be going.
Yeah, I think the example of the like roti gone tech, or like the idea of like scaling these businesses is really very interesting, related to one of the questions that just came in from the audience, which is about the cannabis industry. So we know that the cannabis industry, we know there's a goal for 50% of licenses to go to minority or women-owned businesses. We also know that it's predicted that the cannabis industry in the US will be one of the first industries that's led by women, just on the whole, which is so exciting. And so I was wondering, maybe to take that question, which is really at the crux of a new emerging industry that entrepreneurs will, over the next 5 to 10 years, really take the opportunity to spearhead new business models around, etc. I was wondering, like, what would you say to a young entrepreneur who might be from an underserved community and doesn't have the same access that others do, who is looking to enter this industry or any industry at this time, and wants to take the position of being a real visionary, becoming a founder of a high growth startup that really takes a great idea with emerging technology and brings it to the market? What advice would you give them, given the climate that we know exists between people getting funding, in a challenged state of there being cultural biases that prevent people from, unlocking their full potential to access funding? We know that and we've heard that the social capital that you have and the communities that you're a part of are so fundamental to your success in some way. What advice would you give someone who's just beginning that journey?
There is something to be said about what you know and networking with people in other positions that also know those things. So if you are starting something that you know well, that fits a need for yourself, I always think that's a very important place to start. But it's very important to also find people in other places that understand that need. So whether that's in technical assistance or financing or social capital, because you can do this by yourself, but you don't necessarily have to do this only with founders. You can also do this with funders. You could do this with organizations. You could do this with a friendship circle. And my quick example of this is Squire, which is a Black-owned barbershop app, right? But this is an idea that came from a very specific cultural experience that can be magnified and has raised, I believe, $250 million. But it started with founders who were filling a need for themselves. And it has grown because it is from their perspective. So I think it would probably grown a lot more if we had more funders who understood and went to Black barbershops, but that's a different story.
I also would like to quickly chime in, and this might not be for cannabis industry specifically, but for industries that we have more data on. But I encourage them to go look at our index and see what cities this industry is more inclusive in, where it has most funding, where it gets the most traction. We want the index to be a source for entrepreneurs looking to where should I start my business? Where will I be most included as a LGBTQ identifying individual, you know? So and also a different perspective as well.
Okay, and Sandra, I'm wondering if you can maybe chime in a little bit, because you've had such a digestion of the data, and now hearing some of the things that the panelists have been saying, what they're seeing, you know, in the New York metro area, like in, you know, the more of the grassroots communities in some sense. Does any of this surprise you? How do you see the relationship between what's happening at the grassroots and what's happening between high growth startups?
Well, let me just say that for the second phase of our survey, we're setting the high growth at $100,000 of funding. So, you know, that changes things a little. But a number of things were discussed. Tiffany mentioned the equity incubator. These kind of programs are so important throughout the whole country. And as we roll out other phases of the survey, we hope to be looking at policies and programs. So people who did go through an accelerator incubator program, what was their success rate? You know, where are the gaps there? Also, New York City in January had passed, they're the largest city in the country to recognize LGBTQ business owners as minorities. So all these things are happening now. I don't think there's any one solution to fix this big gap, but many solutions, and anywhere where we have a win in any community goes a long way. So I think that we've touched on a lot of things here. We hope to make people aware that the data is available, you know, for researchers, for students, for editors, to be able to use that data to look at trends and to help level that imbalance that we have in many areas.
Got it. So we're basically at the end of our time window, but we did have one quick question from the audience still that we haven't gotten to, which was, how do we ensure that we're working with communities instead of co-opting work or steamrolling the folks we're trying to represent?
I mean, to me, I think sometimes it's just a simple act of listening, because I think folks are out there doing things, you know what I mean? And among, you know, there's, you know, circles out there that I see from like where, you know, where I sit in the universe, that it's like, okay, well, there are these women who are doing this, there are these men who are doing that, or whatever that is. So people are out there making their way regardless of what other sort of fictitious or whatever you call it, sort of like higher authorities that sort of, or other gatekeepers actually is sort of like a better term for it, regardless of what other gatekeepers are doing. So I think if other funders and founders want to engage people and bring people along, it's going out there and engaging them and educating themselves about what folks are trying to accomplish and what the opportunities are with the audiences that they're trying to touch. Sometimes just get out of the way and let people do their thing. Like trust in people, right? They know their communities best.
Awesome. And with that said, I guess we're going to get out of the audience's way. Thank you so much, everyone who's joined us. And a big thank you to all the panelists. This has been an outstanding conversation. I think we all agree that conversations like this need to happen and need to happen often. And we could be here all day, but we'll respect people's time. And just so thankful for all of you. Please, everyone, including in the audience, please take care, stay healthy, and have a great spring.